Edward of Woodstock, also known as Edward the Black Prince, a paragon of medieval knighthood and medieval prowess, whose legend is woven into the fabric of English history. Born in 1330, he was the eldest son of King Edward III of England, and his life was marked by significant military achievements during the 100 Years' War. His leadership at the battles of Crecy and Poitiers not only demonstrated his tactical genius, but also cemented his reputation across all of Europe, which led to his knighthood at the age of 16. Despite his early death at the age of 45, the Black Prince's legacy as a chivalric hero and capable leader continues to endure, embodying the ideals of knighthood and valor of his time. Hello and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, it's good to meet you, and if you're coming back, good to see you again. If you like what I do and want to support the channel, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. Otherwise, help YouTube push it out to more people by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Now, with that out of the way, get yourself relaxed, because we will begin our history and biography of Edward the Black Prince. Edward was born on the 15th of June of the year 1330 at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, as the eldest son of Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. His birth into royalty came at a time when his father, Edward III, was deeply entrenched in conflicts with France over territorial claims and the French throne itself. This animosity was rooted in familial ties, as Edward III's mother, Queen Isabella of France, was the daughter of Philip IV of France, positioning Edward III and consequently his son in the line of succession for the French crown. The situation escalated when the French king threatened to seize English lands in France, which sparked the 100 Years' War. Queen Philippa, Edward's mother, was the daughter of the Count of Hainault. Her marriage to Edward was orchestrated by Queen Isabella, who sought to secure Hainault's military and financial support to overthrow her husband, Edward II. The union was fruitful, producing 13 children, with Edward being the firstborn. Edward III ascended to the throne at the tender age of 14, after his father, Edward II, was deposed in 1327 by Isabella and the English nobility, due to Edward II's failed leadership and military defeats, particularly against the Scots. In an effort to reclaim lost territories, Edward III initiated military campaigns that mirrored the aggressive strategies of his grandfather, Edward I. His efforts culminated in the decisive Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333, where he avenged the earlier humiliating defeat at Bannockburn and restored English dominance over Scotland. This victory solidified Edward III's reputation as a formidable leader and earned him the epithet Great Champion of the English nation. Now, on to the young prince, whose upbringing was marred by the political and military dynamic of the time. On September 10th, Edward III allocated an annual allowance from the profits of the county of Chester for his son's maintenance, and by February 25, 1331, these funds were entirely assigned to Queen Philippa for the upbringing of both Edward and his sister Eleanor. In July of 1331, amidst ongoing internal tensions, Edward III proposed a marriage between the young Edward and daughter of Philip VI of France, aiming to stabilize relations through marital ties. On the 18th of March, 1333, Edward was formally granted the earldom and county of Chester. Several years later, in a parliament session held on the 9th of February 1337, he was created the Duke of Cornwall, receiving the duchy through a charter dated on March the 17th. This distinction marked the first instance of a duke's creation in England, and the terms of the charter stipulated that the title was to be held by him, and subsequently by the eldest sons of the kings of England. Edward's education was overseen by Dr. Walter Burley from Merton College, Oxford. In March of 1334, the responsibility for managing his revenues was assigned to his mother, Queen Philippa, to cover the expenses of raising Edward and his two sisters, Isabella and Joan. By August 1335, amid rumors of an impending French invasion, Edward III ordered that Edward and his household relocate to Nottingham Castle as a precautionary measure. In late 1337, when two cardinals arrived in England to negotiate peace between Edward III and Philip VI of France, the young Duke of Cornwall met them outside London and escorted them to the king, accompanied by many nobles. On July the 11th, 1338, and again on May 27th, 1340, and October the 6th, 1342, Edward III appointed his son as guardian of the kingdom during his absences abroad. Although Edward was too young to engage in any significant governance, he left the council to manage the affairs. To strengthen his alliances, in 1339, Edward III proposed a marriage between the young Duke of Cornwall and Margaret, that was the daughter of Duke John III of Brabant, and in the spring of 1345, he urgently requested a marriage dispensation from Pope Clement VI. On May the 12th, 1343, Edward was made Prince of Wales during a parliamentary session at Westminster, where he was invested with a circlet, a gold ring, and a silver rod. He accompanied his father to Sluis on July 3rd, 1345, where efforts were made to persuade the burgomasters of Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres to recognize the prince as their lord, although this plan was thwarted by the murder of Jacob van Anteveld. The prince was then tasked multiple times with mobilizing troops from his principality and earldom for the military campaigns in France. Due to the heavy debts incurred in the king's service, his father authorized him to draft his will, ensuring that his executors could access all his revenues for a year if he were to fall in battle. Thus, on July 11, 1346, Edward, the Prince of Wales, embarked on a significant campaign along his father, Edward III. They landed at La Hogue, where the young prince was knighted by his father in the local church at Quetho. Following his knighting, Edward demonstrated early military prowess as he ravaged through Cotentin, contributing notably during the capture of Cannes and the skirmish at the ford of Blanchetaque against Sir Gaudemar I du Fay, which allowed the English army to finally cross the Somme. Before the Battle of Crecy, on August the 26th, 1346, Edward and his father received the sacrament in Crecy itself, preparing for the conflict where Edward would command the right flank of the army. This unit included prominent leaders, such as the Earls of Warwick and Oxford, and Sir Geoffrey d'Harcourt, among others, comprising 800 men-at-arms, 2,000 archers, and 1,000 Welsh foot soldiers. During the battle, after an initial success against the Genoese bowmen, Edward's forces faced a severe challenge from the Count of Alençon. At a critical moment, Edward's division was nearly overwhelmed, prompting his commanders to seek aid from Edward III. However, the king refused assistance, urging his son to win his spurs and earn the victory. Now that's some medieval parenting for you. Well, during this intense phase, Edward was thrown to the ground, only to be saved heroically by Sir Richard Fitzsimon, his standard-bearer. With additional support from the Earl of Arundel, they repelled the French attack. The battle saw significant French casualties, including the Duke of Lorraine and the Counts of Alençon and Blois, leading to a complete rout by the English forces. Well, after the battle, Edward III met his son with pride, commending him for his brave conduct. Together, they paid their respects to the fallen, including King John of Bohemia. Edward's valor at Crecy was a testament to his capabilities as a military leader, even at such a young age, and it was certainly a trial by fire. Say what you want about Edward III's throwing him into battle and not saving him, but certainly he did, as it was said, earn his spurs. Now, following Crecy, Prince Edward played a crucial role in the siege of Calais between 1346 and 47, where it was his job to conduct raids around the captured town, of which he accumulated substantial booty. He returned to England with his father in October of 1347 and participated in courtly festivities, including his investiture into the newly formed Order of the Garter in 1348. In subsequent years, Edward continued to support his father in military endeavors, including the Battle of Winchelsea in the August of 1350, where they confronted the fleet of La Cerda. During this naval battle, Edward's ship was almost sunk by a larger Spanish vessel. It was only through the timely intervention of Henry of Grosmont, the Earl of Lancaster, that they achieved victory. It seems to be a running theme that Edward, the Black Prince, certainly has a lot of good friends by his side. Of course, that always helps. In 1353, disturbances in Cheshire required Edward's attention, as he was indeed the Earl of Chester. He led an expedition to support the local justices, and he managed to quell the unrest, albeit extracting heavy fines from the local populace. His visit to Vale Royal Abbey, mistaken in records as Doulecresse Abbey, led to a generous donation. In 1355, as Edward III prepared to rekindle hostilities with France, he assigned his son, Prince of Wales, a pivotal role in the campaign. It was time for the Black Prince to shine. Just quickly, it's such a cool name. I know that's off topic, but I keep saying it, and every time I do, the Black Prince has such a ring to it. Anyway, Edward was tasked to lead an army into Aquitaine, aligning with broader strategic movements that included coordination with the King of Navarre in Normandy and support for John of Montfort in Brittany by the Duke of Lancaster. This deployment into Aquitaine came at the behest of local Gascon lords, eager for the spoils of war. On July the 10th, Edward III officially appointed his son, the Black Prince, as his lieutenant in Gascony, granting him substantial autonomous powers, including the authority to receive homages. Thus, the Black Prince departed London for Plymouth on the 30th of June. However, adverse winds delayed his departure until September the 8th, where he finally set sail with a formidable fleet of about 300 ships. His force was indeed quite substantial, comprising about 1,000 men-at-arms, 2,000 archers, and a significant contingent of Welsh foot soldiers, alongside 4 earls who were notable figures of military command. Upon the arrival in Bordeaux, he was warmly received by the Gascon lords. A decision was made to initiate a swift, aggressive campaign before the onset of winter. On October the 10th, the Black Prince embarked on his campaign with a well-equipped force that included 1,500 lancers, 2,000 archers, and 3,000 light-foot soldiers. This military venture quickly devolved into a ruthless marauding expedition across the counties of Juliac, Armagnac, Asterac, and the Comminges. Upon crossing the Garonne at Sainte-Marie near Toulouse, which was then defended by John I, the Count of Armagnac, the expedition laid waste to the region. The local garrison, under orders from the Count Armagnac, refrained from engaging the invaders, simply allowing the Black Prince and his forces to continue their destructive paths straight into the Lourdes. The campaign was marked by harsh tactics against the local population, particularly in Montxard, where the troops stormed the town, committed atrocities against its residents, and plundered wealth, including carpets, draperies, and jewels. The people of the region, described by the Black Prince as good, simple, and ignorant of war, were severely exploited. Notably, the only significant resistance came from the Monge, where the chatelaine ingeniously used beehives to fend off the English attackers. Very creative. The prince's army continued its path of destruction through Carcassonne, sacking the town but not the well-fortified citadel. Towns like Ormes and Trebes negotiated to avoid plunder, while Narbonne was not so lucky. Plans to assault the citadel at Narbonne were abandoned due to its robust defenses. Now, during this time, the Black Prince received overtures for peace from the papal court, but deferred any decision pending his father's directive. Ultimately, the expedition, which lasted 8 weeks and only saw 11 days of rest, concluded with the prince's uneventful return to Bordeaux. That being said, it was a very hard trip with all the treasure he had to carry back with him. On the 6th of July, 1356, Prince Edward embarked on an expedition through France to Normandy with the intention of supporting his father's Norman allies, including the King of Navarre and Geoffrey d'Arco. He began this journey by crossing the Dordogne at Bergerac on August the 4th. As he progressed through regions like Auvergne, Limousin, and Berry, his forces engaged in widespread plunder and burning. His approach to Bourget led only to the burning of its suburbs, as he failed to capture the city itself. Edward then turned westward and launched an unsuccessful assault on the Issoudun between August the 25th and 27th. Meanwhile, King John II of France was amassing a formidable force at Chartres, prepared to defend the Loire crossings and reinforcing fortresses at risk of attack. After the failed siege at Issoudun, Edward retraced his route to Vierzon, which he captured, and then decided to execute most of the garrison. From Vierzon, upon realizing that crossing the Loire or joining forces with Lancaster in Brittany was unfeasible, he decided to return to Bordeaux, setting course towards Romorantin on August the 29th. Upon hearing that the French knights had withdrawn into Romorantin, Edward moved to assault the fortress on August the 31st. Despite the stiff resistance and personal loss of a friend which enraged him, Edward succeeded in capturing the fortress by September 3rd. Reportedly, he had used Greek fire to set its roofs ablaze. If you don't know what Greek fire is, it's kind of like an ancient form of napalm, the secrets of which we've somewhat lost since the fall of Constantinople. They've kind of figured out how to do it, but maybe it's not the same. Well, as he continued his march through Berry, King John II, having gathered a large army, crossed the Loire at Blois and pursued the English forces. Despite being significantly outnumbered, Edward commanded about 7,500 men compared to John II's upwards of 20,000. Edward maintained a parallel path to the French, staying just miles away. By September 17th, as confrontations began near Poitiers, Edward positioned his forces on the advantageous terrain, using the natural landscape and fortifications to strengthen his defensive position. Despite the French king's substantial numerical advantage, Edward's strategic positioning and preparation played a more important role. The prince decided to deploy his archers more effectively, using the terrain's hedges for protection. He set out an ambush that proved pivotal in the ensuing battle. On the morning of September 19th, the Battle of Poitiers commenced. French forces, attempting to break through the English defences, were decimated by English archers, as the French ranks faltered. The English counterattacked, leading to a comprehensive victory for Edward's forces. The battle then concluded with the capture of King John II and numerous French nobles, causing significant French casualties and resulting in a decisive English triumph. Following the battle, Prince Edward treated his royal captive with notable respect, serving him personally at dinner and refusing to sit at the same table, citing his unworthiness compared to the great king. Now, this is interesting, because it was this act of chivalry that was praised widely, and it also enhanced Edward's reputation. So whether or not he was doing this as a genuine act of kindness and chivalry towards the French king, or if he just knew this would make him look very gentlemanly, well, that's a matter of debate. But either way, the result speaks for itself. Well, one thing that wasn't very gentlemanly was the amount of plunder he got from the campaign. And after securing these swaths of treasure, Edward returned to Bordeaux, where he spent the winter celebrating his successes. In March of 1357, he agreed to a 2-year truce, desiring to return to England. Despite some opposition from the Gascon lords over the removal of King John II to England, Edward quelled their dissent with a payment and left the governance of the region to local lords. He arrived back in England in the May of 1357, entering London triumphantly with King John II displayed prominently, albeit in a manner that some contemporaries and later observers alike may view as an act of calculated humility. Now, after his triumphant return to England, Prince Edward immersed himself in the vibrant court life, participating in numerous festivals and tournaments. By tournaments, we're talking the knightly tournaments, and yes, they're exactly what you're thinking. Jousting and fights and wrestling, all the rest. It is exactly as you think it is. Now, in May 1359, he and King Edward III, along with other challengers, held the lists at a joust in London. This event, proclaimed by the mayor and the sheriffs, absolutely delighted the people, especially as the king appeared in the guise of the mayor and Prince Edward dressed up as the senior sheriff. The extravagance of these festivities and the generous gifts Edward distributed to his friends led him into more than a few financial difficulties, stretching himself a little bit too thin while he was in the festive mood. Well, recognizing this, the king decreed on August 27, 1359, that should Prince Edward fall in battle during the upcoming French expedition, his executors would have control of his entire estate for a period of 4 years to settle his debts. In October 1359, the Black Prince journeyed with his father to Calais to participate in the Reims campaign, part of the ongoing 100 Years' War. At the conclusion of this military endeavor in 1360, Edward played a role in the negotiations for the Treaty of Brittany. He was heavily involved in the drafting the preliminary truce at Chartres on May 7, 1360, which was established by proctors acting on his and Charles, Duke of Normandy's behalf. Following the campaign, it's likely that Prince Edward did not return to England until after his father, who landed at Rye on March the 18th. On the 9th of July, 1360, the Black Prince, along with Henry, Duke of Lancaster, again travelled to Calais, accompanying the French king. However, they had to return to England as the promised ransom installment was not ready, leaving King John II in the custody of Sir Walter Manny and other knights. In the October of the same year, 1360, Edward was present at Calais for the liberation of King John and the formal ratification of the Treaty of Brittany. He journeyed with King John to Boulogne for a ceremonial offering before returning with King Edward III to England in early November. On October 10th, 1361, Prince Edward got married to Joan of Kent. What, did you think I was going to say another war? It can't all be about fighting. We must take a break from the murder to have a little romance. But actually, it's not that romantic when it's your cousin. Well, of course, marrying your cousin was not such a big deal back then, and far be it for me to push my morality onto others. Well, either way, he married Joan of Kent, his cousin and the widowed Countess of Kent, thus becoming the Earl of Kent through marriage. Joan was the daughter of Edmund of Woodstock, the Earl of Kent, and Margaret, a daughter of Philip III of France. Their close kinship required a papal dispensation for marriage, which Pope Innocent VI gladly provided. Although it appeared the marriage contract was secured before the dispensation, the ceremony was held at Windsor, officiated by the Archbishop Simon Islip, and attended by King Edward III, who was initially unaware of the engagement. The couple made their residence at Berkhamsted Castle in Hertfordshire. Now, on July 19, 1362, Edward III granted the Black Prince all English territories in Aquitaine and Gascony as a principality, requiring an annual tribute of an ounce of gold, and conferring the titles of Prince of Aquitaine and Gascony. After Christmas celebrations at Berkhamsted, the Black Prince departed for Gascony in February with his household, arriving at La Rochelle. There he joined John Candos, the king's lieutenant, and travelled to Poitiers to receive a homage before continuing to Bordeaux to establish his court, alternating between there and Angoulême. During his rule, he appointed John Candos as Constable of Guyenne, and secured lucrative positions for his knights, though his favoritism towards the English led to quite a few eyebrows, if not outright discontent among the Gascon lords, exacerbated by Charles V of France, who actively encouraged local opposition. Despite attempts to mediate regional conflicts and hosting dignitaries like Peter, King of Cyprus, in Angoulême, tensions remained high, particularly with local nobles such as Arnaud Amanieu, the Lord of Albret, and Gaston, the Count of Foix, who openly supported the French. The regional instability was compounded by the activities of the free companies, mercenary groups that had shifted allegiance to Bertrand de Guesclin and supported Henry of Trastamara against King Peter of Castile. When Peter sought Edward's aid and arrived in Bayonne, the prince supported him, further entangling English forces in continental disputes. This period was marked by significant military and political challenges, with Prince Edward increasingly pressed by both local unrest and demands from his father to manage the mercenary bands effectively. Many of Edward's English and Gascon lords were reluctant for him to support King Peter, viewing the conflict as inappropriate for intervention, since it involved a dispute between a legitimate king and his illegitimate brother. However, the Black Prince felt compelled by a sense of royal dignity and the unacceptable precedent that a bastard could usurp a legitimate king. While Peter, seeking further support, promised riches and titles, including making Edward's son the King of Galicia, which actually swayed many to his cause. A parliament was then convened in Bordeaux and deliberated on this matter, seeking the opinion of King Edward III, who endorsed his son's involvement. Subsequently, another parliament agreed to support Peter, contingent upon financial guarantees for their efforts. To this end, the Black Prince agreed to lend the necessary funds to King Peter. Negotiations at Bayonne between Prince Edward, Charles of Navarre, and King Peter solidified their military collaboration. Peter agreed to financial compensations and provided territories as collateral to secure the prince's financial backing. The Treaty of Libourne, formalized on September the 23rd, laid out these agreements in detail, including substantial monetary commitments for military wages and strategic pledges regarding leadership roles in campaigns against the Moors. The prince financed this military venture through various means, including funds received from his father, derived from the ransom of the French king John II, and by melting down his supply of silver plates. His preparations in Angoulême culminated in a festive Christmas in Bordeaux, where his wife gave birth to their second son, Richard, who would later become King Richard II of England. I just did a video on him too. It'll be out soon. Should be. Now, in February of 1367, Prince Edward departed Bordeaux, consolidated his forces in Dax, and marched through Roncesvalles into Pamplona. The loyalty of the free companies shifted back to Prince Edward from Henry of Trastamara, recognizing Edward as their rightful lord. There, from Pamplona, the prince's campaign continued towards Burgos, but strategic challenges and supply shortages slowed their progress. The army also faced harsh weather and logistical difficulties, but managed slightly better conditions in Logroño. The 30th of March, 1367, Prince Edward responded to a letter from Henry of Trastamara, and on April the 2nd, he moved his forces from Logroño to Navarrete, La Rioja. The proximity of the two armies, with Henry encamped at Nájera, facilitated communication, and although Henry seemed inclined to negotiate, asserting that Peter was a tyrant responsible for much bloodshed, the prince maintained his commitment to Peter, asserting the importance of rightful kingship and the defense of royal dignity. On April the 3rd of the same year, the prince's army, consisting of a well-organized force of English, Breton, and Gascon troops, dismounted for battle some distance from Henry's position. The vanguard was commanded by notable leaders including Lancaster, Chandos, and Calvalet, with separate divisions led by prominent Gascon lords, and the prince himself overseeing the main body of the army. Before the conflict began, the prince appealed to divine support for his cause to reinstate King Peter, exhorting his forces with a call to advance under the banner of St. George. The Battle of Nájera commenced with Castilian forces aggressively engaging the English vanguard, but strategic misalignments in Henry's forces allowed the Gascon lords to flank the main body of Henry's army effectively. The prince then led a critical charge with the main body of his army turning the tide of the battle. The conflict ended with Henry's forces in complete disarray, and Henry himself, well, he fled the battlefield in a panic. In the aftermath, while Prince Edward requested King Peter to show mercy to their defeated foes, Peter executed a notorious traitor immediately, and 2 others shortly thereafter. The capture of notable figures such as the French Marshal Arnauld d'Audrehem, a previous captive at Poitiers, led to a dramatic encounter where the prince accused him of treachery. However, upon review by a panel of knights and much discussion, d'Audrehem was acquitted on the grounds that he served not the prince directly, but King Peter, thereby honoring his prior commitment. Following their military success, the prince and Peter advanced to Burgos to celebrate Easter. However, financial and political tensions arose when Peter failed to fulfill his financial obligations to the prince, leading to further complications. Peter's evasiveness and the eventual denial of payment resulted in strained relations, with the prince encamping outside Burgos and later moving to Valladolid in an attempt to secure the promised funds. Valladolid is an interesting town, by the way. A rather infamous figure comes from there, being Thomas de Torquemada, that was the first Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition. I'm sure they don't have, at the entrance of the town, home of the Grand Inquisitor. That may deter certain types of tourists, perhaps. Well, the subsequent weeks proved difficult for Prince Edward and his army. Harsh conditions, disease, and a lack of resources plagued his forces. All this together led to significant casualties. There were allegations of poisoning that were made as the prince himself fell ill, a condition from which he never fully recovered. Meanwhile, Henry of Trastamara took the opportunity to launch attacks on Aquitaine, further complicating the politics. Now, the situation continued to deteriorate, and as it did, negotiations for a safe passage through Navarre facilitated a return through Roncesvalles. By early September 1367, the prince and his remaining forces returned to Bordeaux, marking the end of a challenging campaign marked by initial military success, but brought down by political and logistical failures. After returning to Aquitaine, the Black Prince faced significant challenges managing the free companies, bands of mercenaries who had fought under his command. Around 1366, about 6,000 of these soldiers had passed through the kingdom of Aragon into Aquitaine. Due to incomplete payments, they took up residence in the region, causing substantial disorder and damage. Prince Edward successfully persuaded their captains to move north across the Loire, where they continued their devastation in France, which of course exacerbated tensions with Charles V of France, who was not happy about Edward pushing his problems onto his territory. Charles then seized this opportunity to foster dissent among the Gascon lords and destabilized Edward's authority. One particularly significant incident involved the Lord of Albret, who had initially agreed to serve in the prince's Spanish campaign with 1,000 lancers. However, the prince, citing the logistical constraints, later requested that he only bring 200. This perceived slight deeply offended the Lord of Albret, marking the beginning of a strained relationship that was exacerbated by the prince's failure to pay an annual pension to Albret. The situation worsened when Albret, aligning himself closer to France, betrothed Margaret of Bourbon, the sister of the Queen of France, further alienating him from the prince. Facing financial difficulties from the expensive Spanish campaign and his customary extravagance, the Black Prince convened the estates of Aquitaine in Saint-Emilion and later in Angoulême in early 1368. There, he managed to secure a hearth tax to alleviate his financial strains, though this move was, of course, unpopular and further alienated the local nobility, which I'm sure that the prince was very surprised to hear that they weren't pleased to have another tax to pay. Well, jokes aside, the major vassals of the High Marchers refused the tax. They just said, no, we're not paying it. And prominent figures like the Counts of Armagnac, Périgord, and the Comminges, alongside the Lord of Albret, brought their grievances to the King of France, asserting his paramount lordship over them and rejecting Edward's authority. Well, Charles V of France was happy about this, and he capitalized on this unrest by summoning the Black Prince to Paris in 1369 to answer for his actions, a demand that Edward outright refused, threatening to arrive with a military force instead. Now this tension escalated into open conflict, during which Sir Thomas Wake, the High Steward of Roger, was attacked by forces loyal to the dissenting French lords, indicating a worsening situation for English control in the region. By 1369, a full-scale war was back on. The health of the Black Prince had also significantly deteriorated. You know, that problem with the poisoning. Like we said, it never went away. This, of course, prevented him from taking an active role in military operations. Despite all this, however, he continued to attempt conciliatory measures with the Gascon lords, but it was to no avail, and the political influence of John of Gaunt, possibly acting against him at the English court, further complicated his position. Charles V's strategic deployment of forces into Aquitaine resulted in severe losses for the English, culminating in the siege and controversial capture of Limoges in 1370, where the Black Prince, despite his illnesses, directed harsh retributions against the city for its betrayal. Ultimately, the worsening of his illness forced the prince to retire first to Angoulême and then to Bordeaux, leaving the direct military engagements to other commanders. The death of his eldest son, Edward of Angoulême, in 1371, really hit Edward hard. He was deeply grieved and exacerbated already by his declining health. The last thing he needed was the stress. Following the advice of his personal doctor, he decided to return to England to recuperate. Accompanied by the Duke of Lancaster, he landed at Southampton in early January of 1371 and proceeded to meet his father, Edward III, at Windsor. During this meeting, Edward successfully contested a treaty that his father had arranged with Charles of Navarre the previous month, objecting to the cession of lands demanded by King Charles. After halting the treaty, the Black Prince returned to his manor in Berkhamsted. Back in England, he found himself naturally opposed to the influence of the anti-clerical and Lancastrian party. His stature and the trust he commanded among the clergy were evident when he met with the Convocation of Canterbury at the Savoy on May the 2nd, persuading them to make an exceptionally large financial grant. Well, around this time, his health actually began to show a few signs of improvement. At least compared to before. And in August 1372 he joined his father on an expedition aimed at relieving Thouars. However, bad weather prevented their fleet from reaching the French coast, and the mission was called off. On October the 6th, 1372, citing the insufficiency of revenues from Aquitaine and Gascony to cover its expenses, he resigned his principality, formalizing this decision in Parliament the following month. During the same Parliament, he effectively negotiated with citizens and burgesses to extend customs protections for merchant shipping for an additional year. In 1374, amidst growing tensions with the Church, Prince Edward presided over a council at Westminster, responding to Pope Gregory XI's demand for a subsidy to combat the Florentines. Despite the Pope asserting dominion over England, the prince, frustrated with Archbishop Whittlesey's hesitation, managed to assert the independence of the crown, declaring that no previous monarch had the authority to subject the kingdom to external rule. By the time the Good Parliament, as it's called, convened on April 28, 1376, Prince Edward was widely regarded as a champion of the Commons against administrative abuses. Aligned with William of Wykeham, he opposed the influence of the Duke of Lancaster and the corrupt courtiers surrounding him. Despite receiving a significant bribe rather, from Richard Lyons, the king's financial agent who was under impeachment, the prince refused it, maintaining his integrity, even though he later remarked it probably could have been useful to pay the kingdom's soldiers. Recognizing his impending death, the Black Prince prepared by making provisions for his servants in his will and bidding farewell to his father, asking him to ensure the protection of his son Richard. Now I know I say that casually, but that is so sad. It's so sad that your son would have to die before you. Indeed, it reminds me of the scene in Lord of the Rings where Theoden is burying, I forgot the name of the son, burying one of his sons, and he turns to Gandalf and says, "No son should have to bury his father." Terrible. Anyway, I digress. Well, Edward the Black Prince died on June the 8th, 1376, at the Palace of Westminster. In his final moments, attended by the Bishop of Bangor, he sought forgiveness from God and those he had wronged, leaving a legacy marked by both his military skill and his principled stand against corruption. Now what about the name? Why was he called the Black Prince? As I've said, it's a cool name. It must have a story, right? Well, he acquired his sobriquet long after his death in 1376, The first known use of the name appeared in the writings of the antiquary John Leland, about 200 years later, during the 1530s or perhaps 1540s. Leland referred to Edward as Edwardi Principis Cog Nigri, and the Blake Prince. That's right, Blake, not black, while summarizing earlier historical works, although these sources themselves that he was summarizing did not use that name. Now, this name Black Prince gained wider recognition through Roger Ascham's Toxophilus of 1545, where Ascham mentioned "ye noble Black Prince Edward besides Poitiers." Later, Richard Grafton in his Chronicle at Large of 1569, and Raphael Holinshed in his Chronicles of 1577 also used the term the Black Prince, solidifying its association in the historical narrative. Notably, William Shakespeare also referred to Edward as the Black Prince in his plays Richard II and Henry V. The origins of the name are not definitively known, but theories generally focus on two aspects. One, Edward's heraldic symbols, and two, his military reputation. One suggestion is the name derived from the black field of his shield for peace, or rumors that he wore black armor, though direct evidence for black armor is scant and debatable. John Harvey mentioned, without citation, that Edward was described as wearing black armor of burnished steel at the Battle of Crecy, but once again, without citation. Now, another theory relates to Edward's brutal military reputation, particularly during his campaigns in France. The French soldier Philippe de Mézières referred to Edward as the greatest black boars, a term symbolizing destruction. This reputation for harshness might have contributed to the epithet, as echoed by other French sources, and even in oral traditions in southern France, where he was remembered as l'homme noir, noir being black, Well, in summary, the nickname encapsulates both martial prowess and also intimidating presence that Edward held over his contemporaries, combined with a good deal of later romanticized portrayals that solidified him as a legendary figure in history. Well, thank you very much. If you've listened this long, then you too are a legendary figure in history. Not many people get this far. First of all, I would like to thank my top-tier Patreon supporters, that being Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, and Susan. Thank you very much, and if you would like to make a contribution, no pressure, just enjoy the videos. But if you really feel the need to, then the link is in the description. Until next time, thank you once again for watching and supporting the channel. You have my thanks. Good night, and take care of yourself. Bye-bye for now.